Episode 7 Spellbound. It's a wild night, and you're sitting by the crackling fire with a blanket over your knees. The storm outside is strong enough to hurl the waves onto the shore and rattle the windows of your small stone cottage. Even your cat, who usually enjoys exploring the garden most evenings, is curled up now, contentedly purring in the firelight. At your side is a clay teapot, filled with nettle tea that you brewed to help the stomachache that has been bothering you for a couple of days now. Thankfully, the soothing effect has begun to ease your discomfort, allowing you some much-needed rest. Your eyes are just starting to close when you hear the sound. At first, you think that the banging noise is just the wind, but then you realise it sounds more like a fist knocking on your wooden door. Rising uncomfortably from your chair, you feel the ache in your old bones. You intend to go to the door, but before you can do so, it crashes open with a noise like thunder. The group of angry men who burst suddenly into your home is mainly made up of strangers and some neighbours, but there's nothing familiar in any of the eyes tonight, only hatred, and perhaps something else, perhaps fear. "What's going on?" you ask. "What do you want?" One of the men at the front of the pack steps proudly forward. "You're to come with us," he says. "But why?" you protest. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's what they all say. Our investigation will decide that. Then we'll find out the truth, eh?" "The truth about what?" "About you being a witch." You begin to protest your innocence, but it makes no difference. You are beaten and dragged outside into the pitiless storm, where others are waiting. I'm Norman Brown, and you're listening to the Scary Scotland podcast, where we delve into the darker corners of Scottish legends to make connections with the wider world and culture. Tonight, in episode 7, Spellbound, we will explore the history of alleged witchcraft in Scotland, including an examination of witch trials, the cultural impact of those events, some notable places associated with witchcraft, and individuals who were accused. So make yourself comfortable, pour yourself a potion, and come with me as we explore Scotland and witches. The history of Scotland is one marked by fear, superstition, and savage injustice. During the late medieval period and early modern era, Scotland was gripped by a wave of barbaric witch trials that led directly to the execution of thousands of people, primarily women, who had been falsely accused of practicing witchcraft. These infamous trials were not only a reflection of the religious and political climate of the time, they also had lasting effects on our culture. Thankfully, today there's a growing movement to address the wrongs done to those innocent people wrongly accused of witchcraft, offering a form of justice and at least some acknowledgement for the suffering. But it might help us to understand how this happened if we have a degree of context. The belief in witchcraft in Scotland can be traced back to ancient times. Early European societies often believed in women with supernatural powers, and the concept of witches as figures who could influence events and manipulate nature was widespread. You can imagine how to the ignorant, women with knowledge of herbs, healing and fertility, such as a village wise woman who might suggest that you drink a chamomile tea to calm your nerves or chew on cloves to alleviate toothache, would appear to have special abilities. In the early medieval period, the Christian Church began to consolidate its power in Europe, and with this came the development of a more systemic approach to witchcraft. By the 15th century, the idea of witchcraft itself was deeply entwined with Christian theology, which viewed witches as agents of the devil. Around this time, the Scottish legal system began to codify witchcraft as a crime, and as a consequence, the formal accusations of witchcraft began to gain momentum. The 1563 Witchcraft Act in Scotland made it a criminal offence to consult witches, bewitch others, or sell spells, and this was a major turning point as it marked the formal beginning of the craze of witchcraft persecution in our country. The most notorious period of witch trials in Scotland occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries, peaking between 1590 and 1630. This period was characterised by widespread hysteria, fuelled by a potent combination of religious fervour and political instability. You see, the Reformation had divided the country, and religious authorities were eager to root out any perceived heresy. Protestant reformers, led by figures such as John Knox, saw the robust persecution of witches as a way to protect their faith from other perceived threats, namely Catholicism and paganism. One of the earliest and most infamous witch trials in Scotland occurred in 1590. This case involved the North Berwick witch trials, in which a group of people, including women and men, were accused of conspiring with the devil to sink King James VI's ship as he returned from a visit to Denmark. The trial was marked by the intense torture that led to the confessions, and subsequently the execution of many alleged witches. King James VI himself was deeply involved in the trials, even writing a book, Demonology, in 1597, which outlined his views on witchcraft and supported the ongoing persecution of them. King James's obsession with witchcraft was further demonstrated by the trials of the early 17th century, particularly that of Agnes Sampson, an alleged witch who was accused of causing harm to the king. Sampson's trial and execution in 1591 were part of a larger wave of trials that spread all across Scotland. Throughout the 1590s and the early 1600s, the Scottish clergy, in collaboration with local authorities, conducted a series of trials that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. But it was the early 17th century that saw the witch trials in Scotland reach their peak, with thousands of people being accused, tortured, and executed. In 1628, the Scottish Parliament passed a law that made it a crime to practice witchcraft, and this act intensified the witch hunts across the country. Many women, predominantly elderly and vulnerable, became the target of unfounded accusations based on personal vendettas and slights, community rivalries, or the simple fear of the unknown. The use of torture was widespread in these trials, and it was not uncommon for confessions to be obtained through brutality. Once accused, individuals were often coerced into naming others, creating a cycle of fear and suspicion that led to even more arrests. The witch hunts reached their most extreme levels in the 1640s, when a series of mass trials took place in areas such as the Borders and the Highlands. By the late 17th century, public opinion began to shift. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reasoned thought and scepticism towards superstition, began to influence attitudes towards witchcraft. The last known execution of someone accused of being a witch in Scotland took place in 1727, but of course the legacy of the trials persisted. These witch trials left a stain on Scotland and had a profound impact on our culture. The hysteria surrounding witchcraft reflected the deep social, political and religious tensions of the time. It created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated many aspects of daily life, particularly in rural communities. The idea of witchcraft as a malevolent force, often associated with women, contributed to the demonisation of those women who were seen as outsiders, elderly or infirm. Women were often the primary targets of witchcraft accusations, as they were perceived to be more susceptible to the influence of the devil. This just reinforced gendered stereotypes and further marginalised women in Scottish society. Moreover, the witch trials, rather than combating it, fostered a deep belief in the supernatural. Many of the practices and beliefs that were associated with witchcraft, such as divination, herbalism and healing, were often part of local traditions. However, these practices became increasingly demonised as witchcraft, leading to the destruction of cultural heritage and the erosion of trust in traditional knowledge and healing. Thankfully, in many ways, we are now seeing people increasingly eager to get back to their roots, if you'll pardon the pun, rediscovering the herbal remedies and natural treatments that had previously been used for centuries. There are also geographical reminders of witchcraft peppered throughout this small nation. As a child growing up, I would often walk to the Witch's Pool in Bonnybridge's Chasefield Woods. From my current home here in Stirling, I can see a rocky outcrop on the Ochil Hills known as the Witch's Crag, and there are literally hundreds of such places in and around every village, town and city in Scotland, local sites linked to witches and witchcraft. But such places are often linked through rumour and hearsay. There are other locations that are much more closely linked to the subject of witchcraft and witches. One of the most famous sites related to witchcraft in Scotland is the Witchery. This is a restaurant and hotel located near Edinburgh Castle. The building is thought to have been erected upon the location where many witches were executed during the 16th and 17th centuries. Today, the deliciously Gothic restaurant, with its velvet curtains and black candles, is more reminiscent of Hogwarts than of the horrors that were carried out there centuries earlier, when an estimated 300 people accused of witchcraft were burned on Castle Hill, and even more were strangled to death on the castle esplanade. It seems strange to think that today the fashionable eatery, popular with celebrities, and the grand location of the city's famous military tattoo were previously the site of a much grimmer spectacle. Consequently, Edinburgh saw more unjust executions than anywhere else in Scotland. Given that Auld Reekie was a focal point of witch trials, it's hardly surprising that the city's dark alleys and cobbled streets are said to be haunted by the many ghosts of those accused of witchcraft. But the scourge of the witch trials was not limited to the nation's capital. The Orkney Islands, located off the north coast of Scotland, are another area with a significant history of witch trials. The exact numbers are unknown, but at least 70 women were affected. In the early 17th century, several women were accused of witchcraft in the town of Kirkwall. The trials there were marked by intensive interrogation, and many women were executed by burning at the stake. One notable case involved Janet Forsyth, or the Westray Storm Witch as she would later be known. According to local folklore, Janet was a quiet and shy woman with a particular gift for accurately predicting the weather. Now you might think this would be something the local island community would value. However, her powers were considered to be ungodly when she kindly guided a ship through a dangerous storm one evening. Janet was subsequently brought to Kirkwall and imprisoned in a dungeon which is known as Marwick's Hole. She was due to be executed, but was rescued from this fate by the timely return of Ben Garriach, her boyfriend, who had been press-ganged many years earlier. Ben came to Janet's defence, and she was freed. Sadly, as Stephen King once said, people hate it when you try to climb out of the box they have put you in, and the crowd wanted to see a witch burn. In 1629, Janet Forsyth found herself accused again, only this time of a whole array of occult activities, most of which were contradictory, such as making people ill, but then making them better, or stealing cream from milk. It would almost seem like a Monty Python sketch was it not for the seriousness of the consequences of all of this. Janet was eventually transported to a public site, where she was tied to a stake, strangled, and then burned. This was not an isolated incident. Accusations rose and fell all across Orkney in sudden, frenzied clusters, often linked to external events which unsettled the islanders. The causes of such upset ranged from political unrest to failed harvests, unusual weather and natural outbreaks of diseases. But whatever the situation, blaming a witch seemed to reassure the public, at least until the next inexplicable event. Kirkwall has since become a place of historical interest for all those interested in this dark chapter of our history, with several monuments and memorials dedicated to the victims of the witch trials, and detailed records relating to the prosecutions. Another notable site in the northern part of the country is Dornoch. The town of Dornoch, located in the Scottish Highlands on the Moray Firth, is a picturesque coastal town which boasts long golden beaches. It was also the site of one of the last large-scale witch hunts in Scotland. In the early 17th century, several people, including men, were accused of witchcraft in Dornoch. Many of those accused were executed in public trials, and their deaths were part of the larger wave of witch hunts which spread throughout the Highlands. But Dornoch is notable for another reason. It was where Janet Horne was executed, and if you don't know her name, you should.
She is quite possibly the last person burnt as a witch in Scotland. And it was a brutal affair for Janet, and that might have not even been her name, because as we discussed in episode 1, where Sawney was often used as a generic term for an unflattering depiction of a Scotsman, the name Janet was a common term applied to any woman considered a witch, a bit like the pejorative misuse of the name Karen in some modern and unenlightened circles. Elderly and suffering from dementia, Janet had a grown-up daughter whose hands and feet had not developed properly. Records are unclear of the cause of this condition, but it may have been that the daughter had experienced a genetic disorder. But regardless of the cause, this feature was seized upon by hysterical locals who concluded that Janet must surely be a witch who had used dark magic to turn her daughter into a pony. It was only a matter of days before both mother and daughter found themselves cowering before the Deputy Sheriff, Captain David Ross. He faced the woman in a public building and said the matter could simply be resolved if Janet were simply to recite the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic. Unfortunately, Janet's mental decline made it impossible for her to do so, and so both she and her daughter were found guilty and sentenced to death by burning. It's believed, and I hope that it's true, that Janet's daughter escaped and avoided a brutal death, but there was no such reprieve for her poor mother, who was tarred and feathered, then paraded through a jeering crowd to meet her savage fate. In addition to Janet Horne, several other individuals became notable for their experience in the witch trials. Some of these individuals lost their lives even without ever having been convicted. One such figure was Lilias Eddy. About 15 minutes' drive from my home is a sturdy old metal bridge which crosses the River Forth. If you drive across this and head northeast along the Fife Coastal Road, you will soon find yourself in a small village called Torryburn. It rests on the long shore where the river widens and stretches out into the North Sea, and in 1704 it was home to Lilias Eddy, an elderly woman who, like so many, was accused of witchcraft. This was home to Lilias Eddy, an elderly woman who, like so many, was accused of witchcraft following claims by a neighbour. Jean Bizet, who was recorded as having been in a distressed state and quite possibly drunk, warned others in the village to beware lest Lilias Eddy come upon you and your child. This dramatic accusation led to Eddy's arrest and subsequent imprisonment. During her incarceration, likely involving cruel torture, which resulted in her confessing to witchcraft, she eventually described an encounter with the devil in the harvest before sunset, during which she renounced her baptism. Eddy further detailed that the devil lay with her, describing his skin as cold, his colour black. Eddy further detailed that the devil had lain with her. She described his skin as cold and black. He had been wearing a hat, and that he had cloven feet. But these statements were most likely the sick imaginings of her torturers. Before a formal trial and sentencing could even occur, Eddy died in prison on August 29, 1704. The exact cause of her death remains uncertain. Some suggest suicide, whilst many others propose that the harsh conditions and her physical torture led to her demise. This left ministers of justice with a problem. Eddy had never been tried and therefore convicted, so she could not rightly be burned as a supposed witch, but neither could she be buried in the churchyard after allegedly confessing. Therefore, Lilias Eddy was buried along the shores of Torryburn in a wooden box with a substantial stone slab placed atop her watery grave. This practice was intended to prevent the devil from reanimating her body, a common belief at the time regarding those accused of witchcraft. Notably, Eddy's grave is the only known burial site of an accused witch in Scotland, as most were executed and their remains destroyed. But even in death, Lilias was denied any peace. Over the centuries, her grave attracted morbid trophy hunters eager to bag a piece of a witch's coffin, and in 1852, Eddy's remains were exhumed by local antiquaries. And in 1852, Eddy's remains were exhumed by local antiquarians. Her skull eventually became part of a private collection and was last documented being on display at the Empire Exhibition in Glasgow in 1938, before promptly disappearing. Her coffin wood was fashioned into wooden walking canes, including one reputedly owned by the Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who took it with him to conquer the New World. Fortunately, prior to the disappearance of Lilia's skull, Fortunately, prior to the disappearance of Lilias Eddy's skull, it was photographed, and in 2022 these images allowed a digital reconstruction of her face to be made. This was not the haggard face of some evil witch. The reconstructed image did not feature the haggard face of some witch, but in fact a rather gentle-looking old lady, which was in fact. The rendered face did not look like some haggard witch, but instead resembled a gentle old lady, which is probably what Lilias Eddy was. Another notable figure in this era was Helen Guthrie. In the 17th century, Helen Guthrie, a woman from the town of Forfar, was accused of being a witch and was executed. Her trial was notable, however, as she was accused of using spells to harm others. There was no shortage of local people willing to step forward and blame their individual troubles on this poor woman. The irony was that she was only accused because she happened to be friends with another woman, Isabel Shirey, who had made the fatal mistake of, in the heat of an argument with a local tax collector, telling him to drop dead, which at some point later that day he did. Word quickly spread about the nature of this curse, and Isabel was arrested. Whether as a result of the names given when Isabel was tortured, or merely because of the known association between them, Helen Guthrie and her 13-year-old daughter were soon arrested too. I'm sure you can see a pattern emerging here of women and daughters rather than father and sons being the victims of the hunters and accusers. Remember, this was also a time when everything from illness to crop failure, tripping in the street or milk turning sour was blamed on witchcraft, and everything from eye colour to birthmarks and blemishes could be used as evidence to condemn a person, even without a confession. Guthrie's public execution, along with that of several other women in Forfar, serves as a reminder of the widespread fear and suspicion that permeated Scottish society during the witch hunts. Her trial was thankfully among the last of its kind in Scotland, and her horrific execution marks the end of the witch trials. The irony is that all of this madness and cruelty, which pitched neighbour against neighbour, was carried out in the name of purity and righteousness. Ultimately, the witch trials are a dark and shameful part of our nation's history, but part we must remember in order to avoid being consumed by fear and judgment in the future. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the profound injustices suffered by those accused of witchcraft in Scotland. The Scottish Government has taken steps to address the wrongs of the past, with calls for posthumous pardons and official apologies for those who were persecuted. In 2021, the Scottish Parliament passed a bill that offered a formal apology to the victims of the witch hunts and provided a process for posthumous pardons to begin. This bill is part of a broader effort to recognise the suffering of those accused of witchcraft and to begin the much-needed healing process. The move has been widely praised by historians, activists, as well as the descendants of those impacted by the witch trials. Furthermore, local communities and heritage organisations have also been working to preserve the history of witchcraft trials in Scotland, ensuring that future generations remember the tragic events that unfolded here. Memorials and educational programmes have been established in places like Edinburgh, Torryburn and Kirkwall to honour the victims and educate the public about the dangers of superstition and persecution. We can conclude then that the history of witchcraft in Scotland is a tragic chapter in the nation's past, marked by fear, superstition, and the unjust execution of countless individuals. The witch trials, which peaked in the 17th century, left a lasting impression on Scottish culture, fostering a climate of suspicion and contributing to the marginalisation of women. As Scotland continues to confront this dark period of our history, it's essential that the stories of those accused of witchcraft are not forgotten, and the lessons of the past continue to inform the present. So whilst the word witch might always be connected to notions of dark deeds and formidable power, we will hopefully now realise that these rested with the people who accused, interrogated, and executed the poor woman. But before we dampen down the cauldron flames for the evening, there is one final figure linked to notions of witchcraft that I'd like to discuss. This comes not from the 16th or 17th centuries, but from 1945. Helen Duncan was born in 1897 in the town of Callander in the Trossachs. This place is a picturesque location, fringed by majestic rocky hills and deep forests. It also neighbours Aberfoyle, the location of the enigmatic Fairy Hill from episode 3. Throughout her life in Callander, Helen was allegedly able to speak to the dead, and as an adult, this unusual talent propelled her to the heights of the spiritual movement. Helen would eventually move south of the border, where she conducted thousands of seances in low-lit rooms. But during the Second World War, Helen hosted one such event in Plymouth, during which she summoned the spirit of a sailor who had drowned in the sinking of a vessel, HMS Barham, the fate of which had been hidden from the public. As a twist of fate, there were 2 naval officers in attendance at the séance that evening who were unconvinced by the experience and promptly reported this supposedly supernatural security breach to the authorities. Helen Duncan was arrested and tried under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 in London. Only this time, the woman in the dock did not deny any uncanny abilities. She celebrated them, even offering to summon the dead in order to convince the jury of her authenticity. Unfortunately, the prosecution did not accept this offer, and in 1944, Helen Duncan was found guilty of pretending to be a witch and was sentenced to 9 months in prison. It seems remarkable that in a matter of a couple of centuries, we moved from punishing women for being witches to punishing them for not being witches. Yet there is a depressingly consistent element to both of these outcomes. Of course, there are many people still within the spiritualist community who believe that Helen Duncan was a genuine medium who could in fact speak to the dead. But we will never know, because shortly after conducting one final séance, Helen died in December 1956. But given the nature of her business, it's quite possible that she may actually turn up in some low-lit room, only this time she would not be the host. This time she would be the ethereal guest. I'm Norman Brown. Thank you for sharing your time with me this evening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and rate the show on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, YouTube, or whichever platform you prefer. A new episode will drop every month, so there will be plenty more scary stories to explore. Tonight's episode, Spellbound, featured information from pressbreeder.com, spookyisles.com, and the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. Music was by Alfred Grupestra of A Creative Journey and PG Richmond of Creative Audio. Additional sounds were supplied by the Free Sound community, all of whom you will find over amongst the kind contributors on Pixabay. And as for you, the listener, I appreciate your company, and stay scared.